Professional Podcast. I'm Dr. Chris Love. So today I'm going to continue the discussion about continuum-based thinking by discussing the pain and injury continua. Continua being the plural of continuum. I always enjoy when words are pluralized like that. Anyway, we're going to go over two different continua that concern pain and concern injury. First off, we're going to define a continuum. I know we've discussed this on previous podcasts, but I just wanted to have the definitions be pretty specific here. So two different definitions from different sources. One from Oxford Definitions, a continuous sequence in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different from each other, although the extremes are quite distinct. So that's, I think, a really good definition there because it has the word extreme in it. And oftentimes we're talking about things from a teaching perspective on the extremes. We're talking about what is the extreme worst, what is the extreme best, or we're even using terms like best and worst, which sort of gets us away from the idea of what we're talking about here with the continuum, that there really isn't a best and worst. There's just sort of a blending of things, but there are maybe poles that we could talk about just for an understanding perspective. So when we're looking at a continuum, we're looking at this, it's just a continuous sequence. It's a process. It is not a specific entity. And we can easily turn the volume up, turn the volume down. We'll talk about things like intensity, duration, frequency. All of those things can be manipulated. And ultimately, like the word manipulated comes into play a lot here when we're talking about continuum, is because we're just trying to manipulate variables in whatever way we need to meet our goals. So another definition would be a coherent whole characterized as a collection, sequence, or progression of values or elements varying by minute degrees. So the key word or two words there are minute degrees, that it's small, almost imperceptible changes. And that would be ideal when we're looking at making changes to the body. We're trying to create adaptations. So we're looking at doing something in a manner that the body gets so used to it that it doesn't even notice that it's changing. And when we talk about pain, that's going to be really important, that we want to really teach the body that things are safe in a way that is very gradual, because if we're not gradual enough, the body will actually give us pain because it doesn't believe that it's safe. So the more gradual we are, the less we're noticing that we're actually getting better. In some ways, that is better because we're able to tolerate and take on more, but it's not obvious that we're making that change because the process is so gradual and the adaptation is so gradual. It's not until we look back and say, wow, I'm doing a lot more than I did in the past, that you really appreciate how far you've come. So the first continuum that we're going to talk about is the pain provocation continuum. So this is a series of phenomena that induce the onset of a pain, or another way to say pain would be a subjectively dangerous symptom, something that you find to be dangerous to your body. So it could be numbness, it could be weakness, it could be things like that. And a lot of times the word pain for one person means something different for another person. So to be more general, we'll say subjectively dangerous symptom. The intention here in this continuum is to find the edges of a pain experience. So we don't want to just have this general idea of like, I'm in pain. We want to really know where the pain is provoked. And we want to, if we have in our head a big diffuse area that there's pain, we want to make that a small local area as much as possible. And we have a process of figuring that out. We also want to know where we need to be cautious and where we are good to go. And I think that is one of the most important things from a movement perspective, is to really understand not just what you have to be careful with, but what you don't have to be so careful with, and what you can keep in your game so you don't limit your function more than you need to. And I think the rehab field and the medical field is really good at making people feel afraid of and being cautious. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, if it strips away what you can currently do and it makes you more cautious than you need to be, that is absolutely a huge problem. And I think it's one of the biggest problems we have with chronic pain, is that people are in a state of taking more and more away from themselves in a waiting game for their pain to go away. And that just leads to more chronicity of pain. So this idea of the continuum here is to really try to make it clear what you can do and what you have to be careful with. So the progressive provokers that we're going to talk about, and this is not linear specifically, however, there is some thought to the gradual and progressive nature to how you would use these techniques to try to provoke pain. But different people will find that their pain is provoked in a different order than I'm presenting these here. But there's some thought to it, and there's some reason that I'm bringing them up in this order. So the first thing that we'll look at is graded motor imagery. I'll describe that in a second. Then we'll look at graded direct pressure application, graded passive motion, graded active motion, graded isometric resistance, graded concentric and eccentric resistance, graded tempo manipulation, graded volume, duration, frequency manipulation, and graded novelty manipulation. So the word graded comes before all these, which just basically means it's going to be very progressive in nature, or gradually adding stimulus to provoke or change somebody's symptom. And we're going to do that with all different ones. So when I say progressive provokers here, these are all different modes that we may be able to provoke someone's symptoms. And if somebody's symptom is being provoked with one of these, we may actually move back in this order to say, okay, like that's too much for somebody to tolerate. We might have to give them passive motion instead of active motion, because there is no active motion that they can do that doesn't provoke pain. So passive motion then might be okay, and we can be a little bit more control of how we provoke pain there. And then we can even go back through that and use direct pressure, and then even graded motor imagery. So I'll describe all of these in more detail, but just that's the idea when we're looking at this continuum, is that there's safer and more aggressive ways to try to provoke somebody's symptoms. And then within each of these categories, there is a graded way to add more stimulus that would get somebody closer to pain. So if we're looking at graded motor imagery, and this is a specific concept described by the practitioners at the Neuro Orthopedic Institute, or the NOI group out of Australia, and they describe 3 different stages by which you can look at graded motor imagery. The basic concept here, though, is that this is before movement. This is pre-movement. We could still provoke somebody's symptom, even if we're not asking them to do anything from a physical movement standpoint. So the 3 different stages of this are left-right discrimination, which is the ability to identify left or right images of a painful body part. So that appears to be pretty important in normal recovery from pain, although we don't always assess this, and it's not always necessary to assess it, because usually we can do it with some type of movement, and that movement is more connected to what somebody's functional limitation is. But if movement is so painful and we can't really move in a gentle enough manner to not provoke someone's pain, or to not keep it safe for someone to provoke their pain, we sometimes have to backtrack into this graded motor imagery, which is pre-movement type of activities that may still be able to provoke someone's pain and is trainable. So the thing that is trainable within left-right discrimination is often the speed and accuracy of being able to identify, is it left side, is it right side? And then an app that I'll usually recommend for people for this is the Recognize app. And there's apps for the shoulder, there's apps for the neck, all different body parts. But it basically just flashes images that are either of like a normal human body part, or it could be an abstract body part, it could be a piece of art, but it's some type of body part, and you have to quickly identify, is that a left or a right? Sometimes the images are flipped. So there's different progressive challenges that are within that app, and you get a score for accuracy and speed that you can see change over time, which can be useful. But it can also be an assessment to say, okay, if I make this task too hard and my pain is produced, even though I'm not doing anything, just by my brain having to figure out the task that's being asked, that just gives you a sense of, okay, this is where we're at. This is a baseline now for what produces pain. And that's ultimately what we're looking for here, is we're looking for a baseline of where pain is initially produced, so we can see that move forward over time. We can see that it takes more stimulus, it takes more intensity, it takes more frequency, duration, volume, whatever, etc., to bring pain on. And we do that in a very graded manner. Explicit motor imagery is basically just thinking about movement without actually moving. So you think of this as just visualization training. Athletes tend to do this before they get into sport, but this also has an effect on if we visualize the movement that we know is typically painful for us, does that start to produce our pain without actually doing the movement? And the reason that it can actually be painful is imagine movements are actually decently hard work if you're in pain. We have mirror neurons within our brain. I think about 25% of neurons are mirror neurons, and these are just neurons that will start firing when you either think about or watch somebody else move. So pretty interesting, and it goes to show you how much of the pain experience is from the brain. And that's different than saying it's in your head, which is like an old adage of somehow there is a separation between pain from the head and pain from the body. Really isn't. And we'll talk about the continuum of pain and injury later. But just in this case, when we're talking about pain, we're talking about as a whole body experience. It's not a thing, it's an experience. But the brain and the nervous system is certainly a huge part of that. So we don't actually have to move to create pain. We might just have to think about the movement. And if we're in a bad enough state and the nervous system has been sensitized enough, that absolutely could be the first provoker of our symptom. Another stage here is mirror therapy. And this usually has to be done with, it has to be a limb. So there is a right and left difference because we are basically using a mirror to deceive the brain into believing that the reflection of, let's say, the right hand in the mirror is actually your left, or vice versa. So option one would be you move the non-painful side and your brain perceives you're moving the painful side, and see if that is provocative. And a lot of times the things that we're assessing that are provocative can also be the training. And it just might be a slightly different intensity of the stimulus that brought the pain on. Option two would be to move the painful side, but your brain is actually perceiving you're moving the non-painful side, and see how that affects the pain and the symptom. And then that could be part of the training. So those things can be all manipulated to see if pain is being provoked. And then also, can we do more of them? Can we do more intensity of left-right discrimination? Can we move at a quicker speed? Can we identify more abstract images and not have pain come on? So we both get better at the skill, but we also are not having pain come on with improved skill. So that's what we're looking at with graded motor imagery, and that's what we're going to be looking at with all of these provokers of pain that we talk about. So the next category would be graded direct pressure application. So an easy way to think about this is either manual therapy or massage, self-massage, things like that. But very rarely does that get talked about in a graded fashion. For a manual therapist, oftentimes we'll think about that as therapists, and we do learn it that way, where we have to be very mindful of when we put hands on people of where is the onset of someone's resistance to our touch, but also when they say that there is pain in the moment. Because a lot of times there might be some discussion afterwards where it's like, oh, that felt really good, or I feel worse now after you've done that. But there's a very different process when you initially lay hands on someone and you are asking in the moment, when is the onset of your discomfort? So that it would be an example of graded direct pressure application where there's a progressive increase in direct contact administered to a painful area. But this could be done from a self-administration way as well, where you have a foam roller or a massage ball, and instead of just getting on it and making it hurt, you actually get on it very gradually, and you get to the point where what depth of pressure can I tolerate before I'm in a pain that I don't feel is safe? And then you also have to look at, is there a change in the intensity of pain as the pressure is more sustained? Very closely related to that are what are the initial reactions to initial contact, and do they change with time? Because that can be a very trainable thing, where the initial reaction to a stimulus in general, like a new stimulus, tends to be a little bit of threat, especially if you haven't fully anticipated what that stimulus would be. And then you'll have to have a response to that, and that response will tend to be automatic, which is going to be closer to some type of fight or flight guarding response. But if you're quick to notice that it's not a threat, and then you have a way of training the body to relax into the pressure a little bit better, then the pressure that is being applied, one, can get deeper, and two, it can move from being something that's threatening to something that's actually calming and feels therapeutic. So this graded pressure application can be very specific and very direct, more so than broad movement or any type of resistance. And then we get a sense of, does an individual have a preference for deep pressure? And anytime we're adding pressure, we want to do it gradually from superficial to deep. So superficial being as initial contact with the skin, deep being through layers of skin closer to the skeleton. And we can also look at, does somebody have some type of aversion or preference for light touch? So you could think of light touch as like a tickle type. Sometimes that will actually be more painful for certain conditions, where deep pressure feels way better. And there's different reasons for that. So you get a sense of someone's preference for the pressure application, but no matter what the type of pressure application, there's always this graded application from superficial to deep of how it's applied. And another important concept here would be, does somebody have a preference for applying that pressure to themselves or having another person do it? And then this speaks to the concept of internal locus of control versus external locus of control. Do I want somebody else to take care of me, or I want to be the one in control of working on myself? And then it also goes into, how much do you trust another versus how much do you trust yourself? And I've seen this work both ways over the years in the clinic, that some people really don't do well when somebody else is working on them, because they're in such a bad way that they just don't trust any other hands. And they don't look at it that way necessarily, but every time they get work done by somebody else putting hands on them, no matter how gradual experience that person is, they just seem to get worse. But they feel more comfortable working on themselves through movement, through self-care, through self-massage, because they feel like they're more in control of their change. The next category is graded passive motion. So graded passive motion would be the provocation of pain when a painful area is moved by another person or entity that is not the painful area itself. So the common example is, when is the onset of shoulder pain? When a physical therapist moves your shoulder. So a professional is moving your shoulder. You're not helping them. You're trying to be loose, and they're moving you passively is the term. You can also look at it as, when is the onset of your shoulder pain? When your right hand assists the motion of your left shoulder, or when you use something like a pulley or a cane to have the opposite hand move the painful shoulder. You're not trying to use much muscle activity, but you're trying to take that joint through a range of motion and see when the onset of pain is. This also occurs with restful positions. So you often see this after knee replacements. What angle can you rest your knee while lying on your back on a table before it starts to hurt? So you're not necessarily actively trying to move it there, but if you can't get the back of the knee completely flat on the table and there's no support for the knee, is it painful to lie without support on the knee? What angle can your knee be without it being painful? So that's another way to look at graded passive motion, is we can gradually change positions and have the joint lie in a different position in relation to gravity. So again, there's minimal muscle activity, or that's the idea at least here. As the movement gets more passive, it has progressively less muscle activity from the injured area. So that could be something that we have to take into account. If a joint motion in general is creating pain, how much muscle activity is being done in that area? We may want to take less muscle activity, or take muscle activity away by making it more passive. And then we have more control of finding that exact onset of symptom. And then we also want to look at how supported the limb is being when it is moved. So there is the idea of passive motion. If we use the example of a therapist moving the shoulder, there's a way to do it better and there's a way to do it worse, basically. Or from a graded standpoint, there's a way to give somebody more support which tends to be less likely to provoke symptoms if the symptoms are close by, and less support, which may be purposeful or maybe non-purposeful. Someone might be being careless, but someone actually could be purposeful and saying, okay, I'm going to give your shoulder more support when I move you passively, and then I'm going to gradually take that support away. So an easy way to think about this, if I hold somebody's shoulder closer to their actual shoulder joint, I have two hands and they feel very secure when my hands are on their shoulder, and I'm just moving the shoulder. I'm not moving the hand, the elbow, and the shoulder. I'm just moving the shoulder, versus if I start to move my contacts down towards the fingers and I just help them move. I'm trying to do most of the movement for them, but I'm just holding onto their fingers loosely. I'm giving them a lot less support. There's going to be more muscle activity and more likelihood to guard from the muscle activity when I'm down by the fingers versus when my hands are cradling their shoulder and moving their shoulder with more support. So that becomes something, again, that can be just a careless thing where it's going to hurt because someone is not giving enough support, or it's a purposeful thing that you can actually gradually manipulate. The next category is graded active motion. So this is just provocation of pain when you are actually moving the painful area directly through a range of motion. So in the example of moving the shoulder, this would be you're actively raising your shoulder, and the question always is, when is the onset of pain when you're lifting that shoulder? So we're looking when within range of motion does that pain start? Not just it hurts when I raise my arm, it hurts when, at what point specifically when you raise your arm. And that becomes very important. There's more muscle activity here from the painful area. In order to execute the move, you have to use the muscles around that painful area. And one thing that you're definitely looking for here is how is the movement sequenced? So if some area, let's use the shoulder as a continued example, if that is the painful area, when we go to try to move the shoulder, a lot of times we look at where's the hand in relation to the body. So if I'm raising my hand overhead, well, I must be moving my shoulder overhead. Not necessarily. So there's going to be an attempt to not move the area that hurts the most. So you'll get some movement of the shoulder blade up towards the neck. You'll get some movement of the spine leaning back, leaning to the side. So we want to look at where are other body regions guarding and helping out, because that can also give us some idea of what we have to do to help this person move. We may have to get them to move more specifically from the shoulder, but in a way that's less threatening. So that's where we turn down the volume and we move back through the continuum, and maybe, have them do something a little bit more passively, but do it in a way that they're not using other muscles. And sometimes the pain comes from excessive guarding in the first place. So if we give somebody a little bit of support while they're starting to move more actively, now the guarding of muscles being overactive calms down. The movement gets a little bit better from a sequencing standpoint, where it's actually coming from the shoulder more directly, moving from the center out, as opposed to things happening a little bit closer to the head or neck. All of that can be improved by giving the right amount of assistance to make somebody feel safer and in less pain, so that better habits basically for movement are developed. So an in-between step between passive and active motion would be active assistive motion or assistive active motion, where it would be I'm trying to actively move my shoulder up, but I'm also going to give it a little help from my other hand, or I'm going to have my therapist help me give a little bit, or I'm using the pulley, but I'm not completely relying on my offhand. I'm trying to do as much as I can that feels safe from the side that's painful. And that becomes a nice blending between the two, passive and active motion. And it also becomes a nice way to fully regress, a task when there is a specific injury with an exercise that we're accustomed to doing that we might have done with resistance. Sometimes we have to take that resistance and go all the way down to just a body weight version of that activity. But sometimes we even have to go below the body weight activity and then have assistance with that body weight activity. Specific example, let's talk about a shoulder press. We were doing a shoulder press with weight. Now that hurts. Now it hurts to even do a shoulder press with 0 pounds, but it doesn't hurt if we do an assisted shoulder press where I'm trying to go through the motion of a shoulder press, but a band is either guiding me in the direction that I want to go, or I'm using my other hand, or I have a therapist that's helping me through the motion. So that becomes a nice way to fully regress the same activity that we want to get back to. And then we can also watch us turn that volume back up, and it helps us get back to where we want to be a little bit quicker. The next category is graded isometric resistance. So this is provocation of pain when a painful area is resisted, but the joint position remains unchanged. So an isometric contraction is just that. We are contracting our muscle, but we're not moving through a range of motion of the joint. So an example would be hold your shoulder in this position and don't let me move you. And then when is the onset of pain as the resistance is gradually increased? So, there's two parts of this where it'd be like, what joint position are we starting in? And then what is the intensity of the resistance that is being applied? And again, this could be applied by some other person, by a therapist, or it could be by a wall or something that you're doing your other arm. So a bicep isometric would be we hold the elbow maybe at 90 degrees and we try to push down on the forearm as if we were pushing it towards straightening the elbow, but we just hold our position. And we could give 100% effort there, or we can give 10% effort, we can give 1% effort, right? It's really, the number doesn't matter, but we know that it's very graded, it's very gradual. So we can have some type of objective way that we talk about it and we think about it so we can look at progress over time. So we can say it's a 0 to 10 scale where the lightest pressure that you could tolerate is a 1 out of 10, and the most pressure you can tolerate is a 10 out of 10. But there's some type of idea that we're being very gradual with how we're ramping up that resistance that's being added. And then we can mess around with different joint angles. So we can resist the shoulder at about 90 degrees of flexion, or we can resist the shoulder at about 130 degrees of flexion. And all of those different angles, we're assessing any provocation of symptoms and the onset. And then we have information, how much resistance did we need to provoke that? And were there certain angles where the resistance was a lot lighter than others? The next category is graded concentric resistance. So this is the provocation of pain when a painful area is resisted as the muscle is shortening through a range of motion. So usually this is in the opposite direction of gravity. I'm moving my arm up, gravity is always pushing down. So examples here would be when the onset of pain in your shoulder happens when you're raising your arm while holding 5 pounds. Can also be the onset of knee pain starts when you're standing up. So you're figuring out when is the onset of pain when standing from the chair. Graded muscle activity through a range of motion here is necessary to execute the movement. So we're not just staying in a static position and taking on resistance. We're now taking on resistance through a full range of motion or through a progressive range of motion. And in this case, when we're talking about concentric, we're just talking about, again, when the muscle is actively shortening. Just like we did with active motion, we want to see how the movement is sequenced, and we want to see where are people guarding from, and that becomes important. And it's very obvious here, I think, how you make this easier, how you make this harder, right? Because now we're starting to use some weights. And one of the values of weights is that they are a known entity typically, right? We can label 5 pounds versus 6 pounds versus 7 pounds. So if 5 pounds hurts, does 4 pounds hurt? Does 3 pounds hurt? Like, we want to know that pretty specifically, and we want to be able to assess that. Now, in the assessment process, it's smart to start in a way that you think is too easy, as opposed to starting in a manner that you think is going to be too hard. And again, this concentric resistance can be assessed at various joint angles. So we want to know, when does it hurt, specifically when moving the arm straight forward, but we can also ask, when does it hurt when moving the arm behind us or out to the side? Graded eccentric resistance is just the opposite of concentric. It's provocation of pain when a painful area is resisted as the muscle is lengthening. So that's usually decelerating it in the direction of gravity. So on the way down, when I'm bringing my arm down, I have to use muscles to slowly lower that arm. Otherwise, it would just collapse. Right. Another functional example would be, when is the onset of knee pain when you sit into a chair as opposed to standing up from the chair? So that's a pretty common one that I see. Is the complaint initially is it hurts when I sit into a chair. I want to know when. So we mess around with different heights of the chair and we get a more objective idea of it doesn't hurt until I sit into a 16-inch chair, but it feels okay when I sit into a 20-inch chair. So that becomes how we want to look at this graded process. Eccentric contractions are typically able to produce more force than concentric ones, but that really depends on the speed and intensity of the contraction. But if all things are equal, the eccentric contraction will produce more force than the concentric one. We're still looking at how movements are sequenced and any guarding that goes on in different body regions when we move a joint eccentrically. The application of resistance would be very much the same as when doing a concentric application. However, we're just doing it when the limb is being lowered typically, or when the muscle is being lengthened, as opposed to when it is being shortened. The next category then is graded tempo manipulation. And here, a lot of times we're also looking at a movement as a whole, but now we have to ask it not just to move through a full range of motion, but we have to ask it to move faster. So we can look at this again from a very specific standpoint. All right, now I'm able to move my arm fully overhead, behind my back. I'm able to use some resistance if I go slow with it. Can I up the speed a little bit? Here, when we manipulate speed, we're going to look at examples like, when does your shoulder hurt when you throw a ball? At what speed? How high can you jump before your knee starts to hurt? The height of a jump or the distance of a jump may not seem to be a tempo manipulation, but obviously if we break it down, in order to jump farther, in order to jump higher, we have to use more power in our joints, typically from our hips, but also from our arm swing and etc. So all of that is the speed of motion of generating that power in order to get the output of moving our body either higher or farther. So that is a tempo manipulation if we're making the goal to jump either progressively higher or jump progressively farther, or vice versa if we're trying to regress that because someone's not ready to go at that distance. We're again looking at how the movement is sequenced. When we ask someone to move a bit faster, does it change their guarding parameters? And then the application of challenge here can be objectively graded with certain technologies. So there's force measurements, velocity measurements that you can use, and they'll tend to give you readings in meters per second. That can be pretty objective, and you can use that to train. You could also use that to get a sense of what is your baseline of when your pain starts. Without that technology, you can just use a 0 to 100% scale. So if your movement went from 50% speed to 75% speed when you were standing up from a squat, is that when your pain started? We can have some type of measurement for that, although that's going to be subjective. It could be very specific to the individual that you're working with, and it can still be useful to note change. The next category then is looking at graded volume, duration, frequency, and manipulating those three. So these have different definitions. So basically, volume would be the total amount of activity done over a certain period. Duration would be the amount of time an activity is performed. Frequency would be how many times in a given period an activity is performed. So I put these all together because a lot of times you'll see these don't need to be manipulated when pain is happening after movement, less so than during. And it's a thing that often gets lost, again, in the discussion of what can be manipulated. So if there is a onset of pain that comes on, and it comes on kind of gradually over time, the first thing that you may want to identify is, again, what's wrong? That's usually the first question that you get. But sometimes it's not about something being broken or something need to be fixed. It's just that your body needs to do a little bit less, and we have to manipulate those variables. So we have to get a sense of how much volume does it actually take? How much duration does it actually take? How much frequency does it actually take to bring your pain on in the first place? What is the baseline for that? And that can be a difficult thing to be super specific with, but we at least need to try to explore the question. So how long can you walk before your knee starts to hurt? Not just my knee hurts when I walk. How long before your knee starts to hurt? How many miles can you run in a week before your pain starts? Not just my pain starts when I run, or it hurts when I run. We have to get more specificity there. And then we can think of it as, doesn't matter how many days per week you squat concerning your back pain. If you would just squat 2 days a week, do you have no back pain versus you're squatting 4 days a week and now you're having back pain? Can we just change the frequency, which ultimately changes the volume? And does that have an effect on your pain? All right, so again, this is particularly relevant when the pain, it's not necessarily during, but it's after an activity. It might be the next morning, or it's just generally starting to become a more chronic issue. We have to start looking at these things like volume, duration, and frequency. All right, and then we can, again, talk about how we're manipulating this challenge. Volume, there's an equation that can be used, especially with weightlifting. We're looking at how much weight are you actually lifting, what's the actual load, times sets, times reps. And then we can kind of put that into equation and take percentages of it and get a sense of, if you went from lifting 100 pounds and you were doing a total of 15 reps and 15 sets per week, and you do the same amount of sets and reps, but you now are lifting 150 pounds, well, that is a 50% increase in volume. And it may not feel like a big jump, depending on what lift you're doing, how used to weight training you are, but it's quite a big jump. And when there's pain involved, putting some numbers to those things can be quite useful to say, all right, well, let's still lift, but maybe we'll go back to what you were doing before, see how that feels. First of all, does your pain calm down after those sessions? If not, all right, maybe we have to go down 25% in volume. All right, so we can be pretty specific what 25% means if we have these calculations that we're working with. We can do something similar with duration and frequency. All right, so the last category here is graded novelty manipulation. And that's just basically how new is the change in your activity, and is pain provoked based on the novelty of that change. All right, so again, this is typically when we're looking at pain that's not happening during a movement, but after a movement. And that could be a pretty frustrating thing for a lot of people because it's hard. You're not getting that warning sign while you're actually moving. You're getting it a little bit after. And so the first thing I think about when this is a problem is how new is that activity? And new will oftentimes trump what is deemed to be intense or is actually even deemed to be a lot of activity. So I think the reason that we're distinguishing out the novelty of the activity from the intensity, the volume, the frequency, et cetera, is that it may not feel very intense at all. It may not feel like you've done anything that's that great compared to other things that you do, but just the specificity of how new the task is, or how it's something you haven't done in quite a while, or you haven't gotten into it yet since you've been injured in the past. It's the first time you got back to trying something from coming back from an injury. All of those things will affect this novelty, and that tends to create pain after activity. So the way that we work with this, and then we have to look at it, is we want to actually gradually increase similar activity with less intensity, volume, and duration. So let's use the example of I hurt my back after playing basketball for the first time in a year. The idea, though, is that activity, although you may have done that your whole life, and you may have found that you were able to do that with a lot of volume, a lot of intensity, you were able to play weekends without any type of problem. You haven't done it in a long time. You get back, you play one game, that should feel like nothing, but your body is feeling a bit crippled. Well, we can either say, all right, I'm not going to play basketball anymore. Or if you want to get back into feeling like basketball is something that you can do without it beating up your body, well, maybe you got to start actually practicing a little bit more frequently in a non-competitive manner, and you have control over that. So you can go through the motions of a game in whatever intensity you feel comfortable with, and you can do it for a certain amount of time that you have control with, and see how your body feels after doing that. And if that feels okay, you can up the ante gradually over time. So that's a specific sport example, but you can also look at it as a functional example of, I hear this a lot, I had to clean my attic and I didn't feel like much at the time. I woke up and I was crippled. My knee is killing me. My back is killing me. So how do we take the idea of cleaning the attic? You don't actually have to do the exact same task, but you maybe break down some of the movements that were involved in cleaning the attic, and you start to train those in a way that you have a little bit more control over, so your body gets a little bit more used to the activity. All right, and you can be more specific with it. Sometimes it'll be a gym-related movement, whereas, my knee started to hurt because I was running on the treadmill, and I haven't ran on the treadmill in a year or so. Like, all right, let's not be afraid of the treadmill, but let's get you back into it a little bit more gradually. All right, what was the amount of volume that you did that created the increase in pain? Let's do 50% of that. Let's see how that feels. If that's okay, then we move you back up, get you to where you were the first time you got back into it, and then get beyond there. Because a lot of times, if it's a novelty thing, then you just need to get your body to recognize it as not a threat. So you have to let the initial symptoms that were provoked calm down, but you don't want to run away from that thing that provoked the symptoms. You actually want to go at it, but you just might want to start at a less intense place. All right, so what works really well typically here is to do short bouts of activity with increased frequency when we're dealing with trying to make something less novel. So that would be, I'm going to do the task, but I'm just not going to do it as long, but I actually might do it twice in a day. So I break it up into different bouts. I see this a lot with rehab style exercise, because you're working around something that's already an irritated area, that you want somebody to build some type of strength, build some type of tolerance to give the area the stimulus in order to get it stronger, to condition it in whatever way you're looking to condition it. But it's not going to tolerate a lot. So, the idea might be, well, let's just do it once a week. But the problem is that's not enough stimulus to make much change, and it keeps the movement too new. So if we do a little bit only once a week, then every week you come back to it still feels new to the body, so it still feels like more of a threat. If you do short bouts where you don't irritate it in that short bout, but then you do it more frequently in the course of a day or in the course of a week, it actually kind of works with that novelty manipulation as well, and makes it less threatening. So you get more stimulus, but you also get less likelihood that it's going to be perceived as a threat and provoke symptoms. So that's the pain provocation continuum. Hopefully that made sense. I wanted to go into some detail there. It's not that the general individual that's not in healthcare, that's not a physical therapist, needs to know all that. I just want to make it clear that there's so many different things you can look at when you're in pain that have nothing to do with looking inside of your body at an X-ray or an MRI. It's really understanding that pain is its own thing. It's its own signal that you could work with, and you can have a very specific system for how you look at what is provoking that. And the more specific you can get, the more you can find the edges of that symptom. You have a lot more knowledge about it. It actually becomes less threatening. So one of the words that could be synonymous with pain is threat or danger. So if your nervous system, if your immune system identifies something, some activity as a threat, and it could be, again, some thought process as a threat, as we talked about with graded motor imagery, it can provide pain. And certainly different conditions, the chronicity of pain, all of that can play a role in how easy pain is to be provoked and how dangerous things are. So if more things in life feel dangerous, then it's actually easier to stay in pain. So it's important to have a sense of control by looking at being able to manipulate variables pretty easily, by making things easier, by making things harder, but to stay in the process. I think that is so important, is that you don't look at it as somebody else has to fix me before I can get back into this participation process, is that you're always in the process. And if you're a therapist or a practitioner working with someone in pain, that you have this process it's the same thing, that you are constantly trying to assess and help somebody assess their own symptoms, and you have ways to make it safer and make it easier, make it less threatening, and then you have ways to progress when the time comes to progress. So the second continuum we're going to talk about here is a pain injury continuum. And that is just something I've defined as a spectrum of variables that either associate or dissociate pain and injury. And talked about in another podcast that pain and injury are not the same thing, although they often get talked about as the same thing. So how do we separate these two, or when are they more the same thing? So the variables that I'm going to look at are how direct is the mechanism of injury? Do you know exactly what caused your pain and caused your injury? How acute is the pain or injury? And how specific or objective are the tasks that you need to get back to? All right, so the mechanism of injury, do you know when it happened? Were you playing a sport and you turned your ankle and you're like, oh, that's when it happened. You felt a little pop in your knee, things like that. The more exact the mechanism, the more you know exactly what happened, the more it's related to a structural injury. Conversely here, there are many times where you'll actually have a mechanism of injury that you know an injury happened, but there's not a lot of pain, especially in the moment. It may come on a little bit later, but the two are still in this moment not the same thing, because you know you had an injury. You can look at the common example of Achilles tendon ruptures. A lot of times the people that get these ruptures in the middle of a sporting event, they don't even know what happened at first. They just can't walk. They just fall down. And then later on, I'm sure that they're in some pain, but that's an absolute tissue injury. You had a rupture of a tendon. It's not uncommon that you get some of these ruptures and you're not in pain, but you know an injury happened. And then sometimes the two just start to work together where, okay, the pain becomes decently significant and it gets progressively worse because of that structural damage. But you could start to link, if I'm getting pain in the area where I just know I ruptured something, you kind of understand why that pain would be coming. Insidious onset, on the other hand, would be pain that arises slowly with no obvious cause. So when this is happening, if there's a gradual worsening of consistent or episodic insidious pain, it's less likely linked to a specific tissue injury. And it might be something, again, we have to take through that pain continuum that we just talked about. Acute versus chronic pain and injury. So acute pain tends to be short-term, and oftentimes it's more directly linked to a known injury, disease, or medical procedure. And it's often sharp and intense. So, the thing with acute pain is a lot of times it's the worst pain from an intensity standpoint. But if you know the cause of it, if you just had an injury and it's related to that, or you just had a surgery and it's related to that, it's actually a lot less limiting in one's life in the long run, because it will come and go. It'll go through a more natural process of recovery and healing than chronic pain, which is not often as sharp, but more dull and diffuse, with certainly periods of intense exacerbation. But the problem is it lasts much longer, and it doesn't really have a specific timetable that you can point to from a tissue healing standpoint. And it's certainly less linked to specific tissue injury. So in this case, it's really more of a relearning process. You have to relearn what is safe. And again, that links back to what we just talked about with the pain provocation continuum, is we're trying to use that system of turning the volume up, turning the volume down on what provokes symptoms as a way to teach and have somebody relearn what they can and can't do. The last variable then is return to function, and that's looking at, what do you have to get back to? What is the pain taking from you? What do you need to be able to do to consider your pain or your injury resolved? How demanding is what you need to get back to? How modifiable is what you need to get back to? I think that's one of the most important questions there. And is there a specific timetable for your return? So the less modifiable the task, the worse the prognosis tends to be. If we look at sports injury, and I think a lot of times when we look at the podcast space, when we look at the people that have the biggest voices in injury, it tends to be coming from the sports world. And I think that's great, because you get to hear what maybe the best athletes, some of the most fit people in the world have to do, right? And they also have a lot of resources when they're working with these high-level athletes. The problem is, when you're an athlete, what you have to get back to is very different than when you're not an athlete. So it's a very, very different process. And oftentimes, I think that's part of the conflation of pain being the same thing as injury. Because in sports, a lot of times pain and injury do go hand in hand. You can usually link back, you can even see it on video, of what caused somebody's onset of pain or onset of injury when you're looking at an athlete. But you also have to get back to something that is very, very demanding, and it's not very modifiable when you're competing at the highest level. right? You can't tell the team that you're playing that you want to work at a lower intensity or at less duration. You have to do whatever the sport asks you to do. And at the highest level, that's quite a bit. So the discussion about sports injury and the discussion about chronic pain outside of sport are very, very different discussions. But when we're looking at return to function, everybody's got something they want to return to, but it's not always presented that way. Many times when I see people that are not athletes, they don't really often have a specific request of what they want to get back to. They just want to get out of pain. And I think it's important to actually be able to link the pain to what is it taking from you and what can we modify about what's provoking your pain so that we can put your pain in a process of activity and not have it be, I want to be pain-free. I don't want to have this pain anymore so I can get back to exactly what I was doing before. And that might sound condescending, and I don't mean it to be that way. It's just oftentimes that there's a disconnect there of looking at it as I have pain, there's something wrong, what's wrong, as opposed to looking at it as what is specifically provoking it, and can we modify that thing, and that can we make that modification actually pretty convenient in your life? Or is it something because the task that you want to get back to is pretty high demand, or it's pretty important in your life or your job or your function? If it's really high demand and not modifiable, that's going to be a harder thing to work with. And if there's a timetable that you have to be back quick to full participation, that's even a harder thing to work with. So all of that really matters. And with acute injuries, you'll tend to have a more specific time frame for the return to full participation. That doesn't always mean it's quick, but it's a little bit more known. When you have a chronic episode that keep popping up, there may be a need for more ongoing activity modifications on a regular basis. So that's just going to be part of what you're thinking about at all times. You're even starting to see this in sports quite a bit. There's the difference between somebody returning to play after an ACL rupture or an Achilles rupture. There's a certain timetable that they're looking to go through that's still variable and could have a huge range to it. But there's protocols that you're going through. And then there's the idea of load management, which I live in the Philadelphia area. I think has been popularized by Joel Embiid, who we love in Philadelphia, but we need to manage his load so he doesn't get hurt so often. But, you know, and there's debate whether that's a good strategy or not, but that's certainly a different thing than the idea of the protocol of returning from a very specific injury. There's oftentimes just on an ongoing basis, we're going to have to look at how much load, how much volume, how much duration somebody does in their activity. And the more chronic the episode, the more valuable general conditioning and capacity training is. And again, in the highest level of sports, you'd imagine these individuals are pretty fit, but that would be something maybe you look at a little bit more, but certainly there's a lot more room for that in the general population. But again, if there's a disconnect between looking at pain as something like I can't actually get more conditioned, I can't improve my capacity, or it's not important for me to think about that until my pain is gone, that's going to be a problem, because the number one thing you may need to do if you're in a chronic state of pain is make your whole being as healthy as possible. So improve your capacity to tolerate more. And that comes from sleeping patterns, nutrition patterns, certainly getting more tolerant to exercise. And that goes back to the idea of using that pain provocation continuum, not just to show you what you have to be cautious with, but to show you what you don't have to be so cautious with, what you can continue to do, what you can continue to condition. And that needs to be going on at the same time that you're working on getting more tolerant to what you have to be cautious with. So hopefully this discussion here around pain makes sense. I've done several podcasts on pain because it is, you know, one of the most important topics I have to deal with, and it's also a very confusing topic, and a lot of education is needed. I wanted to try to make this as objective as possible and kind of lay this out here. This is a system in the way that I think about the people that I see and I've been working with for coming on 20 years now. And it's certainly a system for me that it has evolved, but it always goes back to this idea of having a continuum-based way of thinking as opposed to looking at things as entities. So with pain in general, like it gets construed as it's a thing. I have a pain. I have this thing that needs to be exorcised from my body, like it's a demon. And there's a purpose for it, but it's not a thing you can point to in the body and say, oh, there it is, there's pain. It's a process that is many systems, almost all systems in your body are working at creating pain and making it more or less intense. So I think we have to appreciate that. And the more we appreciate it, then we have to have a system of working with it, not, again, trying to eradicate it. Because it's going to be there. And most of the time, you want pain to be there to a certain extent. You want it to warn you about changes that need to be made. But a lot of times when it comes on gradually and insidiously, we don't get a sense of what we need to change. We just think that something is getting damaged within us. But ultimately, all pain is telling you to change something. So we just have to have a system of showing how little. We might not have to change that much. We just may have to change very specific tasks a very specific way, and then we can watch them also get better, while other things that maybe we weren't doing enough, we can up the ante on, and that improves our conditioning and our life in other ways. So hopefully that was useful. If you have any questions, you can go to movementprofessional.com. I'll see you next time.